Hey guys, I'm in the forest outside of Kiev. I just got back from the front to the south of Konstantinivka, near Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. I was with FPV teams and vampire teams, bomber drones and such, as they were fighting back the Russian advancements and doing logistical support efforts, at least the vampire drones were. And I come out here after a lot of these embeds in order to, clear my head a little bit. And I thought while I was out here, since I'm not going to be streaming as I'm trying to go back to my home in the United States, and I'm going to be getting on a bus soon, so I can have a month and a half away from the war before coming back and finishing some documentaries. I have the Cross documentary coming out next. I hope you guys see it when it comes out. The situation over there right now is very tense, and I hope people pay attention to the situation there. But right now, at the moment, I'm filming around Konstantinivka, and I was out there when Zelensky reversed his decision. When he completely was like, okay, we're introducing this legislation. I now think that these organizations where our legislation removed the independence of these anti-corruption institutions like the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, we're going to reverse that. And we're actually going to reintroduce legislation that restores independence. But now the guys have to take lie detectors because we need to make sure that it's not infiltrated by the Russians, because out of 700 employees at the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, 2 of them were suspect for reasons that included marijuana smuggling in Dagestan, even though the audio they posted indicated they were talking about Uzbekistan, traffic violations, and to be quite frankly, nothing that clearly established Russian intelligence involvement. Nothing that has been presented to court for the journalists who were there looking at the investigations that have been made public. Has there been evidence of these are 100% bona fide Russian agents? It's, well, this guy's father has a Russian passport, which, let's talk about Syrskyi, if that's the situation. But that's all a different thing, okay? If there's Russian agents in the organization, go after the Russian agents, obviously. That makes sense from, a Ukrainian, national defense perspective. But why are you going after the independence of these agencies when the SBU found agents that were Russians in them? And when the government found that, did they close down the SBU? No. SBU continues despite any amount of Russian agents or payoffs that have been made to SBU officials in order for people to dodge conscription. So, obviously, when these types of issues exist, the dodging of conscription with payoffs to SBU officials, the corruption scandal of the military hospital administration, contracts being given to companies for rebuilding efforts that are shell companies created by those officials' friends, who then give them a kickback and then waste the funds, the few funds that the Ukrainian taxpayer has to give the government. Or the scandal when it came to the military jackets, or different scandals that have risen in the past few years during the war. These scandals have questioned the fact of patriotism or national defense being so strong, the inclination for it, that it would overcome one's natural greed. The greed still exists, and therefore, as long as the greed still exists, the need for anti-corruption efforts still exists in the country where corruption is very much a real problem. And so, the Ukrainian public made it known. They got on the street, they protested, Zelensky reversed, and here we are. So, from that perspective, a lot of people in my circles are giving Ukrainian civil society a lot of props. When I was on the front, I was told by one drone pilot who says they only get 2 hours of sleep every night. They have no clue what's going on. They heard there might be Russian agents in it, but if there's Russian agents in it, go after it. But I don't really look into it, right? Who, the bare minimum take, they read a headline about what Zelensky said, and then the next person who was, at a command, commanding a drone post, looking at the footage, they were paying a lot more attention, and they were hyped about the protests, hyped for the fact that people went out there and pressured the government. And I know a lot of my colleagues out here, journalists, they're giving a lot of praise for civil society, and quite frankly, I think a lot of praise should be given. That the Ukrainian civil society said that they were not allow the hard-fought win of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and that bureau's independence from the Prosecutor General, which is directly appointed by the president and therefore could be subject to political sways and manipulation. This was a hard-fought win, and they would not let the specter of wartime or anti-Russian, anti-Russian spying operations be used to eliminate their independence. And so, in my circles, that's the general perspective I have seen overwhelmingly, right? I've yet to find somebody who's really dug into it, who accepts Zelensky's answers. And for the ones who give him the most credibility when it comes to it, because I can't imagine a situation of just information maybe I just do not know. I am not, omnipotent in any way. Why was there not a proper discussion societally before these actions were taken, rushed quick, with the final decision being done at 1 a.m., which for, I think, some Ukrainians really bothered them about Zelensky's final signature being literally in the middle of the night at a time. I mean, people remember what happened with the anti-EU efforts being pushed through by Yanukovych in the middle of the night, and the response that garnered. And so ultimately, I think the fact that the government backed down could indicate a hey, look, we're not going to make the same mistake of the past. We're not going to do that. If we made promises to keep these institutions, we're going to have to do that. If the public is really going to hold us to account, which it looked like they were, with the protests on the second day after everybody had learned being even bigger than the protests on the first day, which broke military curfew. So I think Zelensky saw that, wanted to back out, and hopefully it's going to be reversed, but there's still time. There's still time for something to be changed. It hasn't been passed yet, hasn't been put through the Rada yet, and there are at least 70 officials, reportedly, within his party, within Zelensky's party, the Servant of the People Party, that are against going back, that are like, hey, we're scared of revenge from the anti-corruption institutions, which probably is the most corrupt-sounding sentence, and I'm trying to not be like, kind of like point out, but come on, it's just, I'm scared of the revenge from the anti-corruption institutions, and it's just hard to believe. It's hard to see it as anything else than either them not wanting to go back on what they had already done and look, flip-floppy, or the fact that maybe they are afraid that these organizations might launch investigations into them for corruption that they had participated in and would rather not see dug up, unless somebody can present me with evidence that these organizations are particularly hunting down people in Zelensky's party who still have the majority in the Rada, still control the presidency, and despite all of this, Zelensky is still, of course, widely respected in the West and still respected to a degree in his own country. But I will honestly say that I wouldn't be surprised if Zelensky's popularity took not only a 2-digit hit, but if it moved from a majority of the public supporting him to a plurality. I'm not going to say now the majority don't like him now and they all hate, but I would say that this type of thing is an indication of a break in public trust, how all of this went. He reversed course quickly. He didn't have this open conversation with the public. And so I'm hoping that this is most clearly an indication that Ukrainian civil society is strong. It maintains itself through the war. I think a lot of the statements of, hey, there's no elections right now, and this shows that Ukrainian society is actually, held by a dictatorship. It shows pretty quickly that the Ukrainian public can take its fingers and clasp the throat, clasp the windpipe of the Ukrainian government very quickly and say, we don't want, we've been here before. Okay, I won't go any further than that, but we've been here before. And I think that the Ukrainian government, this one coming to power post-2014, took that indication pretty quickly. But we still have time. Now, if you're the Russians and you're seeing this, you'd imagine, wow, Zelensky is getting backlash. We're seeing $1.7 billion of aid from the EU being held up, real thing, because Zelensky basically did this, tried to remove the independence of these organizations, which the European Union indicated very quickly that their independence, the creation of organizations like this, would be a necessary framework for them to join the European Union. And considering how many people lost their lives at Euromaidan, how many people have sacrificed so much for European Union integration, how integral it is talked about for Ukraine to be part of the European Union, even from Zelensky himself, to have these aid cuts, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. So you would imagine that the PR disaster, the aid disaster, even though the aid will, if Zelensky goes through with, placing independence back, the aid will probably be resumed. Maybe he really thought that the European Union didn't think they could afford to do any aid cuts, but I mean, if you give the Europeans a chance to pass the buck on a responsibility or, keep some more of their money, I don't think it's going to be that difficult to imagine a scenario where they do, even if you just cut all the financial aid to your social services, which is what was cut. It's aid to not weapons, it's aid to pension programs and stuff that is necessary to keep the Ukrainian government afloat, to keep the people basically with money able to participate in the economy, to keep the structures of your institutions, your government workers paid. Stuff that's integral, but it's not hard for a European government to say, I don't want to pay their pension. I'll pay for your bomb to keep the Russians away from me, to be very blunt, even if it doesn't sound that nice. And so you would think the Russians, seeing this threat possible to aid, even though if Zelensky goes through, again, it could be restored, seeing the pressure put on Zelensky, seeing all of this chaos in the headlines of these protests, and giving knuckle draggers like Marjorie Taylor Greene the opportunity to go out there and say that these protests had to do with ending the war. They didn't. They did not. I knew I was on the front during this, right? So I talked to the soldiers about it. I didn't talk to the people at the protests about it, but I know people who were there, and at no point did they indicate to me that there was like end the war chance or anything. It all had to do with restoring the independence of anti-corruption institutions. And a glorious purpose that is, but that's what they were talking about. So I just can only take it as just like 100% unknowledgeable propaganda. But why didn't the Russians pick that up and run with it? It's not like the Russians haven't run with unknowledgeable propaganda before. Go look at Russia 1 or Radio Pika or wherever you want to get your... I'm going for the references I think most people won't understand. Go to Russia Today, okay? Any of these places. Why wouldn't they run with that story, though? Because they didn't run with that story. If you go look at Russian media today, they're not running with the Zelensky is being held to account by the true patriots. That's not the story they're running with. In fact, if you don't even need to go into the Russian-speaking environment where it is, I think, the most clear, you can even stay in some of the English-speaking environment and some of the people like Armchair Cope Lord who are spinning the idea that these protesters were Davos paid by Davos, paid by basically to give you some translation for those who might not speak online and speak, just like globalist delusion. Paid globalist protesters, paid by the globalist institutions like Davos. They made the people go out on the street in record time, okay? If you go and study what actually happened when it comes to like CIA influence to try to like overthrow the president of Iran during, Mossadegh, if you go and actually study it, and it is interesting history. There was like an actual like propaganda campaign that they wanted to start, even though the actual amount of influence that had in overthrowing the government is probably immensely small to almost non-existent, as there were other probably more influential figures, definitely religious figures, that were involved in overthrowing the president. But if you go and study that involvement and that interference in those domestic affairs that we did participate in, it takes like months and weeks. Like it's like a concentrated effort. This happened in a couple of hours, right? And they're saying it's Davos protesters. Go over to Russian media, they say it's Poroshenko protesters. Just like whoever funded the people for Poroshenko, probably like a George Soros type figure, is Poroshenko protesters who are doing this. They're attacking the protesters. They're not like being nice to Zelensky, like brave Zelensky, put down the globo homo. But they're treating it as that these are agents of the West, these people who are coming out to protest against Zelensky. And that's strange, isn't it, that they wouldn't take that opportunity? Well, so I thought about it, and I think I landed at the conclusion, which makes a lot of sense to me, that the Russians fear Ukrainian civil society more than they fear President Zelensky. Zelensky's one guy, okay? His performance in Paddington was not that incredible to make him immortal or some god or deity. One day he will die, just like everyone else, me and everyone else will die, or they will fall out of favor politically, or they will do X, Y, or Z, right? Maybe he'll decide that he needs a Netflix special once this is all done and release books forever, or who knows, okay? The Netflix special, I do think, is coming when this is all over.
Netflix special good.
The Netflix, my cameraman said Netflix special good. So Zelensky is just like one tiny issue for the Russians. He's a very, when I say tiny issue, I mean in the grand scheme of things. Like, he's like 5% of the problem. Because Zelensky goes, there's still other people who can take his place. Budanov, there's Yarmak. I don't think anybody would be excited about that, but Yarmak. There's other people who, and if you read that report of how Yarmak talked to the Russians when they called him and told on him, please convince Zelensky to end the war. It was one of Russia's envoys. He just, F you, just hangs up. Like, that's not somebody who I think's going to, surrender and make Ukraine part of Russia. Even if he is somebody that Ukrainian civil society is not particularly excited about. And so there's all these people that have either personal reasons, national reasons, any number of reasons, who are still in positions of power that could replace Zelensky. And then there's the rest of society. And this is, I think, the biggest problem for Putin, is that if Vladimir Putin back in Moscow decided to pass something like this, what would the reaction be? Do you think Putin would back off of it in the way Zelensky did? Do you think there would even be protests like this in the first place? Especially now, 3 years into the war, when they had anti-war protesters taken from protests directly to the conscription office and forced them to sign military papers. Do you think, in this current environment, if Putin, for whatever reason, that the final straw after everything was him removing the independence of an anti-corruption organization, do you think he'd get this reaction? Probably not. I'm going to be frank. Probably not. It's impossible to know what will be the final straw on the camel's back, but I would say, I think not in this case. So, from Russia's perspective, I think that the fear that civil society could enable things like continued anti-Russian occupation, supporting anti-collaborationist, not only political leadership, but also continue to support institutions that make it harder for the Russians to control Ukraine and harder to deteriorate the state. Corruption is a rot, okay? There was radio programs done during the Second World War that didn't just encourage Germans to surrender, it encouraged Germans to steal. Things like, hey, if your officer's taking some off the top, why don't you take off some off the top? If you're not going to run away from your position, you can at least sell the gasoline out of the back of the truck. And this type of, if you normalize that type of corruption, it can undermine the war effort, it can undermine trust in the government, it can have a bunch of deteriorative effects on Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian war effort. And on top of that, corruption is a device for political manipulation. And it is something that you could use to subvert people's democracy. It's one of the reasons why corruption is so bad, is because then people will choose their own personal financial interests over the interests of individuals. If you go into Yanukovych's palace, which has now been turned into an anti-corruption museum after an oligarch tried to turn it into his personal penthouse, and society fought it and then turned it into an anti-corruption museum. Beautiful story. His bed were made of like Lebanese cedar. There's a couple dozen Lebanese cedar trees in the world? He had a palace, a corrupt palace, and Ukrainian society doesn't want that. And so they fought for these institutions so hard, but the people that Russia has done business with when it comes to Ukrainian politics and Ukraine have done financially well. And if you look at the people that they've done business with in Moldova, it's the same thing, where the police raid these politicians that are working with the Russians, and they find bags of $100 bills in their floorboards given to them by Russian agents. Okay? This type of corruption is a tool of foreign manipulation. And this has been a tool for manipulation for hundreds of years. If you go back to some of the flaws that was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth model for how they govern things and how they tried to manage government, part of it was just the ease at which with how foreign powers could manipulate its politics through corruption. It wasn't the first instance, and it certainly wasn't the last instance. And so this is another thing that Russia can use to control Ukrainian society. And so if it is undercut, that's a problem for Putin. In fact, when Putin invaded, one of the things that he's talked about before was the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. He wanted it shut down. He thought it was a bad organization. He called for it to be shut down. Putin is against it. He's against an organization that has independence from Zelensky's office, whose only job is to go after corruption, is to find ministers and find those with complete independence without governmental manipulation and then snuff out that corruption. And by doing that with independence, it's harder for somebody to just step in and have the prosecutor general say, "Don't worry, buddy, I got you covered." That's one reason, I think, very clearly as to why the Russians are talking about it very negatively. And I think another reason as to why the Russians are talking about it very negatively is they don't want that type of sentiment spreading home. I mean, what if Russians read the newspapers and say horrible Nazi dictatorship, globo homo, trans Ukraine is able to have its public basically protest, go past military curfew and say, "Screw you, you are not going to use this specter right now to rush through these reforms to remove the independence of these anti-corruption agencies." If they read that as that story, what does that say to the Russian public? Well, I thought they were that's the dictatorship. If over there they can do it, why can't we do it? Especially if you've been telling the Russian public that, hey, you're all the same. But also, not only are you all the same, also all the good ones have already left and bomb them. If you're watching DylanBurnsLIVE, it doesn't have to be consistent. A lot of these narratives, they just have to bombard them enough that you don't really know what's true, what's not. So you just clutch on to whatever is easiest to believe. But if they can see that as what's going on over in Ukraine, that's a problem. So it's easier to say, well, Zelensky's bad, but these protesters are also bad. So Zelensky, for removing the independence of these organizations, that's not bad from the Russian perspective. In fact, those who voted with the Servant of the People Party in the Rada, which is a banned opposition party, its MPs are now unaffiliated. It wasn't that the MPs were removed. It's the party by which they operated was banned due to what the government accused of pro-Russian sympathies and collaboration. You can look into the case yourself. But the point is that there were many people there who were at the very least Russian sympathetic. That was the only party that voted with the Servant of the People Party in the Rada for the legislation removing the independence. And I thought that was fascinating. I really did think that was fascinating. So I think that the Russians have both the motivation of wanting to keep this avenue of political manipulation and also wanting to make sure that the Russian public doesn't think that, hey, corruption in the system in Russia still exists, and it is necessary for the type of, clientelism and corruption for the system to work, for Putin to keep support from certain powerful people. And so if that system was threatened at home in Russia, that's just another axis by which stress can be placed on the system, stress can be placed upon Putin's power structure, another straw on the camel's back, so to speak, or a lot of straws, depending on if protests were to really happen, or if discontent was to rise, and people were to connect the amount of political corruption to the need for the Russian public to martyr themselves in machine gun fire for villages in eastern Ukraine, in order to stay out of poverty, as the social programs and pensions of the Russian public are further threatened by the continuation of the war effort. So I think the Russians have interesting reasons for wanting to be against the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and I think it is the clearest indication that the future Ukraine would have with Russia would be a return to the old, as why Ukraine is in the status its economy is leading up to this war and before this war, compared to Poland, compared to states that were able to reform its economic structure faster, even though Poland still has its own problems, compared to Czechia, compared to other places that post-Soviet collapse were able to challenge oligarchs more effectively, challenge corruption more effectively, and I don't think Ukrainian society wants to return to that, so they protested, but the threat to corruption is a threat to Russian manipulation and also a threat to the bottom dollar of even some in Zelensky's personal circles. So you create strange party votes in the Ukrainian Rada during these strange times. Anyway, I thought the Russian perspective on this would be interesting to talk about, because when you look at the Western commentary, much of it's very shallow when it comes to anti-Ukraine stuff of, oh, this is against the war protest. They don't even know what they're being protested. So I thought going over to how the Russians would react to it would show something very fascinating. Hey guys, I'm in the forest outside of Kiev. I just got back from the front in Touretsk. Sometimes I like to come out here, despite the slight mine infestation. Sorry, I said that over. Infestation.